Hello, can you hear me?
Yep. All right. Hey, Grant.
Hey, how's it
Awesome.
going?
Good. All right. You guys, lucky audience members get a twofer today. So I've got two really exciting guests joining us today on WTF as RevOps. So part of what I want to start really kicking off as we think about, what is revenue operations is like, who does revenue operations support? And, as we think about revenue operations and our key stakeholders, SDRs are a huge component of that. So I've invited, don't tell your peers, but two of my favorite SDRs from Deel to join today. I might introduce them as the quota killers, and they can share a little bit of context behind that for the audience. But before we jump in and go too deep, Skylar, Grant, want to introduce yourselves? Skylar, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name's Skylar. I'm an SDR at Deel, and I've been at Deel for I think 9 months now. And yeah, I'm really excited to join the podcast and have a conversation.
Awesome. And Grant?
Yeah, my name's Grant Kenney. I was an SDR at Deel for almost 14 months and just moved up to the client development account executive side. I got really engrossed into SDR work, and that's how we ended up here with Skylar today. So I'm super stoked to talk about RevOps.
Awesome. So one of my, favorite questions to ask, and I think you guys are going to provide just such a different perspective to this, knowing that you guys are consumers of, revenue operations and partners versus in revenue operations. WTF is revenue operations in your perspective, right? What does that mean to you when you hear that term or think about that team?
Yeah, I can go for it on this one. So I think after kind of working with some of the RevOps people and like understanding like just from our end, and like doing my own research as well, I think part of RevOps comes with a lot of data driven data driven results that are like drive in revenue for the company, and like that's what I see it as, and how like certain workflows or certain like activities drive in different revenue for the company, and that's what I personally see it as.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback off of that, when I really learned more in depth about RevOps, to me, it kind of became apparent that it was more of almost a roundtable for all departments of the sales cycle. You have the marketing, you have the sales, you have the frontline sales, you have the customer success. And it was a point where all that came together and you were able to make a plan to utilize all the information and data. And that's what RevOps does for you on a day to day. So I kind of picture RevOps as a round table and also a Swiss Army knife for anyone in any part of the sales cycle.
Sounds like I might be doing my job well. So that's good reassurance over here. As we think about, SDRs in particular, and for the audience, talk to me about some of the challenges that SDRs face operationally. What are things that, in your day in, day out, we'd love to like have solved, and like those nuances, and as we dive into like how RevOps and SDRs can work better together.
Yeah, I'll take the lead on this one. I think there's a lot of incongruencies throughout a SDR's day to day, and RevOps, one of the big goals is to kind of refine that process because we have all these data points depending on your tech stack. There's Salesforce, there's Apollo, maybe I can't think of the other CRM softwares. And generally, a lot of SDRs have notes on one platform, notes on the other, and none of that is congruent. So one of the big goals is to get that to be all congruent, and that's one of the most useful things RevOps can do.
How many tools do you think you touch a day? Like different systems, do you think you guys log? Yeah, I mean, are we one hand or are we two? Or are we moving to toes as well?
2 hands.
I think I'm at
Best
5 or
skill.
6.
What does ideal state look like for that, right? So like obviously there's not, I mean, I think ideal states that there's one platform that just does everything, but I don't think that's realistic state. Like what are things that could be done to make that easier, make that better?
Yeah, I see when I like go from prospecting to adding people to lists to calling, so on and so forth, like sometimes these people have been touched already, or I have personal notes on them that I like don't necessarily like I have in one tech stack that then I look at them in another tech stack and like they're not necessarily transferring over. And I think something that like that just to kind of answer your first question as well, that I like run into difficulties with is like having all of that transfer over effectively so that I don't have to like toggle back and forth between all platforms to understand like what I need to say or what the past conversations were. And it kind of having that in place would keep me in sort of a flow and keep my time efficiency there. And so sometimes I think with like from a like having all those tech stacks, it can cause they're very helpful, but then also the other end is sometimes it doesn't all sync together in the way that
Yeah.
they're supposed to or you want to.
No, absolutely. I'm going to change topic just slightly because I'm really curious on your perspective. Like, what separates a good SDR's workflow, or like, let's talk administrative or like time management versus like a bad? I mean, I know we can say like, what's a good SDR versus a bad SDR, and we say like who's hitting their goal or not. But like, what are the behaviors that really like strong SDRs are doing when it comes to like operations management, cadence management, like those components that you see?
Consistency. Like if you could put it into one word, consistency with your tech stack, with your reporting, with your forecasting, with literally just doing every aspect of the job. I think that consistency is probably the most important word and mentality for any person who wants to be a successful SDR. And I mean, to be more specific of how that transforms into their day, it's consistently prospecting, consistently tracking, consistently going through your steps in your cadence, and making it systematic to where, because as an SDR, we're given all these tools, we're giving cadences, we're giving information. It all works. One of the biggest struggles is just doing it consistently and actually letting it work. Because when you lose that repetition of doing it day to day, that's when the system starts to kind of dissipate and not work as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna challenge you really fast on this, Grant, because I've got a probing question, and I know you're like, what am I getting myself into? How do you know that your consistency is right? Right? Like, what are the things that you look at to say, like, my process, so I always think about like, if I do something well or I'm doing something right, I'm probably not doing it good enough. So how do you make sure like through that consistency you're optimizing?
That's a phenomenal question.
You've been throwing $20 words at me all day, so I gotta throw them back.
That's a first because I can't spell $20 words. Trust me. But to achieve optimal performance within that consistency, I think to answer your question, setting a baseline for yourself, finding metrics for yourself. Obviously, you're giving metrics from your management, but that's calling, that's emailing, et cetera, et cetera. But setting a metric for yourself that is achievable, but improvable, and something that will obtain the metrics for your managers. So, if I want to prospect 25 accounts a day, one, to make sure I improve is I know if I do 10 before I do anything else in the morning, I'll do more than 20 later in the day. And that's how I set the baseline for myself. But if I don't do that 10, I'll barely do 20 later in the day when I'm finding net new accounts. And so I think a lot of it comes down to setting a realistic metric for yourself that is not overachieving, but it's setting the standard and utilizing that as your baseline. Does that make sense, or is that still kind of a little generic?
I'm going to add one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Skylar.
So I think based off of all those things, we have our consistencies, we have our metrics, we have all those things. And I think something that is also really helpful is using data, which we can get from RevOps, to kind of dissect how our results are affecting like our overall performance, or are like what we're doing on a day-to-day is affecting our overall performance. And like whether that be call connects at certain times, whether that be like types of accounts that we're reaching out to that turn into opportunities, or close one, or anything of the realm of that, like analyzing how and what we're doing on a day-to-day, how that is actually driving in revenue versus like just doing the action, doing the thing. Like there has to be some sort of result, and we want to have the data there to maximize those results. And so yes, consistency is very important, but then fine tuning your consistency to make sure that you're doing the things that are actually bringing in the most revenue.
Yeah. And to piggyback off that a little bit, when I think as an SDR who wants to be successful in setting up a baseline and improving upon itself, I always looked at it like you have those basic metrics for yourself. And, it's really easy in the SDR's position to get entangled into, I want to be better at this. I want to be better at this. I want to improve this. Maybe I should try this. Maybe this new idea, maybe I can come up with some new cool report, utilize data. But I always go back to my base metrics. If I have not completed this, and this today, not allowing myself to think about a cool new way or try something new or try a new technique. And that's how I built myself up as a successful SDR, by ensuring that my first priority is doing the absolute 3 basic things: prospecting, calling, emailing. And then that's the base of your pyramid. And then you kind of go talk and hang out with Skylar over here, and she sees data and she sees this, and you put together and you put that along your baseline, and then you build up the rest of pyramid because you already completed the baseline.
Yeah, it's that whole consistency versus like improvement, right? And I think, champion challenger is a good way to look at this. Is like you've got your champion, what's working, like you've got that baseline. So then how do you look at the improvements and the challenges that you can iterate and improve on? One of the things, and I think I know what, Grant, your answer is going to be on this, but I'm still going to ask you anyway, but I'm going to ask Skylar first, is like, what's the most effective habit that you have kind of going into your days or into how you approach your role?
Yeah, actually, so I do this every single day, and this kind of goes with keeping the cadences going. I don't ever have overdue tasks. And like I do that because in my head, it keeps the flow going with like prospects getting called, prospects getting emailed, so on and so forth. And then from there, I'm always like, with that, I'm then prospecting an amount of people every single day, adding them into my emails, and then they're starting. So every single day, I'm getting like, say, 50 people in and like to call throughout the week. And then that kind of keeps the flow of my pipeline like pretty steady. So there's not one day where I'm like, oh, I have 600 calls to make, but the next day I have 0. Like every day it's pretty consistent in that way.
I feel like Skylar would have major anxiety looking at my phone right now and how many like unread messages I have. And like,
I mean, I'm not perfect. I still have that problem too. But that's just like kind of how I think of it, because it makes my life easier. It makes like forecasting a little bit easier as well. Like I know every month not every month, but every week, like what to expect. Like if I'm getting like these X amount of accounts that are in this industry that are meeting these criterias, then I'm not like blindsided at the end of every month of like how my performance is going to be. And like, that's just like a basic level of me not having overdue tasks and then putting the same amount of people in every single day to keep going forward and being steady in that sense.
Grant, what's your habit?
I mean, first I have to say Skylar is exceptionally organized when it comes to this. Like I aspire to be that person with 0 overdue tasks. If I could do that, it would make my
I don't even think I'm I'm not an SDR, but I'm pretty sure I probably have overdue tasks in our sequencing tool in some way, shape, or form. So like
other than that, I mean, I think, and I'm probably gonna change a little bit up here because I think Skylar answered that question perfectly. I'm going to say a habit, not sure a habit, more of a mindset, is being creative. I see consistently the SDRs who can be creative and look for opportunity and build that into a habit of always, looking at accounts and looking for opportunities as a habit rather than just looking at an opportunity or looking at an account, and having that creative mindset, I think, is one of the most successful things you can do, because this job is so not monotonous, but it can become monotonous. It's doing the same thing, repetition, repetition, repetition. So if you can make a habit out of looking for an opportunity, then that's when you take a good to be a great SDR.
So let's drill into that, right? Like, what are some of the things you do to keep it fresh, like, and keep it creative? Like, what are some examples of situations where you've applied that creativity, or you've seen, success from other SDRs on the team too?
That's great.
Did you say Grant?
Do you have an example?
Well, to be honest, I think Grant does a pretty good job of this too, but I think like how I love when I see someone like you give someone a call and it's obviously their cell phone, and then they send them a text instead and then book a demo or book a meeting. Like that's an example of being creative, kind of doing something a little bit differently. Or alternatively, like people send video messages on LinkedIn and it gets people engaged. So like doing things like that kind of maintain creativity, but then also from another end, when you're prospecting and you see an account that has I don't know, different criteria, or they're growing, or they had like something happen cool that's at the company, and instead of sending them a one-off email that doesn't have like much person, or like that isn't as personal, or yeah, it isn't as personal, you can go the other way and add in sort of like what they're doing at the company, how you see like it's really cool, add like a personal touch to it, and it kind of creates more engagement on the prospects end, because like there's so many of us and there's so many different tech stacks and there's so many different like things going on all the time. Like how do you set yourself apart? And like that's kind of where the creativity comes in, because it's not just creativity within like our company, it's creativity within all SDRs, because all these people are getting reached out to. Like
I get about 40 cold emails a day, I think, on average, right? So like I'm always curious, like how do you work to stand out?
Yeah, which is a huge thing where creativity plays into place. And I mean, there's so many options. And I think before we get to that point of how do you stand out, I look at creativity at a lot of it as, I look at a prospect or a company almost as a piece of Play-Doh. I can mold them to what I want them to be, especially in the SMB space, because I can find out their funding. I can look at their press releases. I can do a little bit of digging and find out so much information that I can find an opportunity before they see the opportunity. And when I talk about creativity, sometimes that's where I really have a light bulb, because when you're reading about their expansion plans, you can figure out how to be a part of that. A lot of times I think people look at trying to sell something as they have a problem and we're trying to fix it. And they come to us with a problem, and that's why we fix it. And I think a lot of really successful salespeople look English, I'm sorry. Get creative when they see, because they find that pain or that need before the prospect ever does. Because I think so much of this is about the timeline, and that's where I look for creativity in an account. You get a timeline and you find where you can fit in your product and what you're selling before they have a need for it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And the question I think about this, where my operational mindset goes, and right, how we work together is like, how do we help you scale that, right? And obviously, help you become more effective with your time. What you mentioned and you just outlined, like that is a time extensive process. And like, I think part of what I think about a lot is like, we want to provide the best experience to a customer. And I think that's exactly what you're doing, right? And I love that you're not just spray and pray, right? You're putting in the research, you're creating the value, and you're doing those pieces. How do you do that at scale, right? You know, how do you do that for 20 accounts a day, or whatever, you know, your goal is when you think prospect, right? What are the things that like RevOps could do to help augment that?
So I'm going to step in here because I think like when we look at prospecting, there's different like buckets and different percentages in which you reach out to people. So like say 10% of people that have already talked to us, like 30% net new accounts, 30% of other types of accounts, like having different buckets so that like, for example, the research that Grant does, like it's really hard to have someone else do that for you. But what's not hard is to have maybe like a list of accounts that we can then go supplement our prospecting to, not have necessarily like the nitty-gritty details on this company, but then we can have these accounts to reach out to and like supplement. And then from our perspective, that 30%, extra 30% of accounts that we haven't touched yet that are like to fulfill our like X amount of accounts that we need to get per week, that can be where we get creative and we do things like how we want it. But then that other 70% can be lists or something that's generated from RevOps. Because like I'm sure that like, and I personally feel this too, like I don't necessarily want to lose the prospecting side because it is really important. And it's kind of gets like it's kind of creates a talk track for me. I'm sure Grant as well. When I'm like even calling these people. But doing that all the time is also really challenging. So having like sort of like a percentage breakdown of like lists that RevOps creates that could be good accounts to reach out to, plus our like, I don't know, I'm giving an arbitrary number here, but 30% of us being creative.
Yeah. And I think like the thing that I take away when you talked about that, right, is like the prioritization, right? And how do you best kind of tier and segment based on the ICP and based on these data points that we know and like things that we can best quantify, whether that's using intent data or firmographic and enrichment information to help tier, right? And then making sure like as data comes in, as we're sourcing, as you know, RevOps is helping to supplement the prospecting process, we're in alignment of like, how do we help you guys augment that same way like marketing does with scoring, you know, hey, this account did X, Y, and Z, they're a good fit, like here's how you should reach out there. Grant, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things about having RevOps enable SDRs better is making sure that the SDRs are educated on what RevOps does and what they actually have connected to the day-to-day. Because if I'm being completely honest, I would guess the majority of SDRs have heard the term RevOps, but have no clue what they actually do for them or the sales cycle. And I think that is step one if you want to have a really good usable relationship, is making sure they know how RevOps works and what specifically RevOps can actually do for them. Because the SDR mindset is so, SDRs want to book a demo. Like, and in a day-to-day of an SDR, our only goal is booking a demo. So unless you can give them something actionable, it's going to be hard for it to gain traction for them. So I think the first thing is to educate your SDRs on what actually happens within RevOps and what that can translate into something they can actually do that day, which can be a list of prospecting, that can be that X percentage of accounts, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm laughing because I want to ask a really loaded question, but I'm not sure I want the answer to it. So maybe I'm going to hold on that till we get closer to the end, because I might put myself on the spot, right? When we think about, you know, RevOps and collaboration there, you know, we talk through like, let's educate. And I think that that's so foundational and so important, right? But what do you think like becomes kind of like the crux of success in that? And like in my mind, I think a lot about like process, right? And making sure like there's a clear and a consistent process. And that ties in with it back to Grant, your point of like the consistency piece. Like, but then going one step back, I think about like enablement, right? And onboarding and like how critical is that from, you know, a revenue operations perspective to SDRs? Like what does good onboarding look like? How do we set SDRs up for success?
I think that's a very good question. Setting up an SDR for success is, I would probably say, educating them about the unpopular aspect that being an SDR can be a numbers game, and being upfront about that so you avoid them learning that on their own. Because obviously, from a RevOps point of view, you're going to want a quality over quantity approach. And so I think one of the first things you can do is make sure they know that it can be done this way, but we prefer it not to be done that way. We prefer quality because we don't want to burn leads.
Yeah. And I think about baseball a lot, right? Like you've got to, especially when a new rep starts, you know, at some point you've got to get at bats, right? You're not, you know, I can't remember who the baseball player was who hit like 3 home runs their first game, but generally like you're not getting up to the plate and you're swinging and, you know, hitting it out of the park your first time. Like you've got to learn and like you've got to build that confidence and those pieces. And that's, you know, I think why we start with, you know, the quantity, right? Because you've got to get the reps in, but then as you perfect your process and have your consistency, that's where like you really can focus on the quality factor of that as well.
Yeah, so I'm gonna step in. So I think like from an onboarding perspective, like obviously quantity is, you're right, at bats. Like I also think of sales as kind of a metaphor to baseball too, in the sense of like you fail more often than you succeed, and baseball is sort of the same way. And I like onboarding, having the clear understanding of how to best use your tech stack so that you're every time you're using it in the most efficient way possible, and from there having that like baseline knowledge, and then of course bringing in like accounts, like quantity, calling as many people as you can, like understanding what works, what doesn't, like that's super important in the first months. And then as you keep going, like then you sort of transition again, like you said, to quality, but then maintaining sort of like an understanding of what RevOps sees as quality. Like, what are the accounts that are coming in right now that are closing? What are the people right now that are wanting to sit on a meeting with us? Like all those different things. Like what is the most effective way to outreach in order to book a meeting? Because I see that from my personal perspective, but those things tend to change as the economic climate changes, as like as a company's product changes, like all those things transition. And so I think it's really important to keep those conversations going, not just like in onboarding and enablement, but like as you progress. And then there's always room for improvement as an SDR, as anyone, and like acknowledging that and using like the team, the RevOps team, any other team, like how to like kind of shift what you're doing or keep doing what you're doing in order to continue being successful.
Yeah.
How do you know you've been onboarded? Oh, sorry, Grant, you can finish your thought there too.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I apologize because I realized I kind of went for a very holistic answer and went on a sidetrack to onboarding. I think one of the key things, if you want an SDR to be onboarded successfully, is having a very clear example of what the process would be for them. You know, it's literally a step-by-step. Hey, this is how we find an account on LinkedIn. This is what we do. We go to Salesforce, we go to Apollo, we make a list, like literally have a step-by-step example of what works so they have something to base that upon. Because I see in a lot of onboarding, it's kind of, well, we have this program, we have this program. This is kind of the goal. Let's figure out how to put this all together. And then you figure it out. And if you had a set example of do this, this, and this is your baseline, that would become a successful onboarding.
Yeah. And then to follow up, like, how do you know when you've been onboarded, right? Like what does like, okay, I know I've got it covered. Like I have been successfully onboarded, or does that ever happen?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the latter. Nail on the head with the latter answer you said about never knowing.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's always adjustments and always, changes in process and things expand and opportunity, right? Like I don't know that you ever are fully onboarded until things change. And that's where I think, so much enablement is such a foundational piece of revenue operations, not only the tech and tooling enablement, but the process enablement, the how to understand the data components, and like plays such a valuable part to like SDR and sales success.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something now that as this conversation's going and like my like my ideas are firing, I think something that could be really helpful is like having some sort of office hour or something that like kind of just like to talk with like the teams like and the
Mhm.
cross functionalities to see like what they're seeing, what they're doing. Maybe like it can help you as the SDR understand like different like revenue funnels, like different industries that are seeing a lot of activity. And also like with that, it's sort of up to us to use those resources to the best of our advantage. Because if they're like not if they're there, then that's great. But then also we have to take advantage of them to see like how that's going to work for us in order to improve. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to think about is if those resources are there, like how are you using them? Is it something that's like that you want, but you're not attending or you're not like taking advantage of, you're not talking to the right people? Or is it like it's along the lines of that, like just understanding that you always need to get better and like what are those resources to do so.
No, absolutely. So, one of the things I want to cover next is Skylar and Grant, you guys kind of took your experience as an SDR, as SDRs, or passion for being SDRs, and did something pretty unique, right? So you guys have actually started, the quota killers. Like, I'm very like curious, like, how'd that happen, and maybe like take the audience through like where you got to this point, and like, where it's at today, and where do you guys see it going? Now that Grant's not an SDR anymore, too, so I got to know who's gonna kill the quotas.
We still have quotas to kill. I think we're both going to end up in a position with a quota to kill for a substantial time coming forward. How did it get started? I don't know. Skylar, you want to take the lead on that?
I think so again, it's kind of clear that Grant and I are both like creative in the sense of like wanting to see how processes can improve, like what we're doing. And like Grant and I, like in the beginning, like made a friendship, I guess, and like started to like kind of talk back and forth about like what's working for each other, like what companies you're reaching out to, how you're doing it, so on and so forth. And like I think it was just created in the sense of like it's a creative outlet for us to then chat about what's like a way to think about this process of being an SDR, kind of documenting what we're doing now and how that's going to change as we move forward. And like also, there's not that much content right now that is written by someone that's in the weeds. Like all of it is like looking back on like your past like role or whatever. Like right now we're like doing it and
Yeah.
there's not any of that. And so we sort
You
of
live and breathe it. It's not just some sales leader who's like, this is how you should prospect, right? Like it's coming from, and that's the thing that I love about it. And one of the things, from my perspective, I was like, what are SDRs doing, right? How are they doing it? Like what pains are they seeing? And like being able to like see that was so helpful for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think we kind of really, like Skylar said, we both had very much the same intentions. We were kind of aggressively looking for success in our jobs and our roles. And we realized that there's lots of really good information out there on the internet. looking, with people in similar situations, but it's on LinkedIn, it's on Instagram, it's on TikTok, it's on a blog, it's on something. And it's a full-time job trying to find it all, yet absorb it all.
Right.
And like you said, from people who are all over the space, not necessarily in it day to day. And we were kind of just like, well, we're in this day to day. We look for this information actively. Let's put it, centralize it, curate it, so other people can take advantage of it and, learn from our mistakes and put themselves forward also.
Yeah, and for context for like the audience who don't know, and Grant, Skylar, feel free to chime in. Like this started as more of like an internal newsletter just for, Deel SDRs of like how can they help support kind of the internal team. And as it's grown, and I've dropped the LinkedIn page in the chat for anyone to look at it, it's like grown into more of like this thought leadership socially for any SDR, right? So if you're an SDR listening to this or on live, like check it out, right? It's great. Great there. I'm sure Grant and Skylar are totally open to additional collaboration. And I feel like this isn't just only living in the SDR world. As Grant expands, and we might see like full scale revenue quota killers. So
that's the goal. It's kind of more of, we want to document what we go through, because there's so many people that would be able to take advantage of it. And there's, like you said, it's just so many good pieces of good information, but it's not curated and centralized. And
Yep.
One night we were like, let's just do it as a newsletter for Deel. And it was like, why not put this on the internet? This could help a lot of people. And ever since then, it kind of took off. Skylar and I have very much the same personalities, and we also have very different personalities. So it plays off of each other well. And I think it comes up with a very good perspective.
So let's talk about, one of my biggest pet peeves, and I did a conversation, with Jared, who runs RevOps, on one of his channels, was, SDR shaming, right? So you'll see these blasts on LinkedIn of people who will, generally they block out names, right? But they shun kind of like the prospecting piece on public channels, or complain about, the call they got. Like, what are your thoughts on that, right? Like, what can we do to just, one, be better about those components, but also like kind of set those expectations, right? Like, I think there's a certain type of person who does that, but we all know that like SDRs are working to do a job. They've got aggressive goals. Like, how do we help improve that and help make that better?
So first of all, I think that maintaining, so if I'm calling someone, and I don't know, some people may disagree with me on this one, but this is how I personally think about it. It's still like human to human. Like, yeah, they'll give me an objection. I'll try to go back on that and like do that. But there's a level of respect that you have to maintain with these people, regardless of seeing them on the phone or not, because ultimately you're speaking for your company and just yourself, honestly, because I call people and they see me, I connect with them on LinkedIn. Like, so it really truly is like, it is a personal brand thing that I have to maintain. And having, like, there's some things that you can't control. Like if someone's going to be upset, like you have to realize like, okay, this is like maybe a personal thing that they're going through. I know I didn't really like step on anyone's toes, and like you just have to kind of let those things go. But then there's another side of it where you have to respect the person's, like, I guess, privacy in a sense. Like, I don't know if there's another word for that, and make sure that you're staying respectful of who they are. And like, I always kind of go in the perspective of like, what does it feel like to be on the other end of the call? And like, how does that feel towards that person? And if that's like crossing any boundaries for myself, then it's not good. And so always keeping like the other person is the number one most important thing in all of this. Like, that's why we're calling them. Like, we want to help them. It's not about us. And so just I always keep that in mind.
Grant, anything to add? I think that was a pretty good answer, Skylar.
I mean, it was a phenomenal answer. Yeah, and then like, and outwardly, we see this public shaming on LinkedIn and stuff. That's always going to be a part of it, like there's always going to be someone upset. There's always going to be someone who doesn't appreciate your work. It's like part of that's just going with the flow and accepting it. and respecting them. And like, you know what, if they want to be unhappy about it, that's them, you know?
How do you cope with rejection, right? I know that is such a loaded question, and I see you guys both smile, right? But like when as somebody, I've never been an SDR before. I've managed SDRs to some extent, but I haven't, sat in that role before. And like the thing that I think a lot about is like, you get more losses than you get wins, right? How do you keep motivated? How do you, go that? I mean, I was going to make a really bad joke, but I didn't do it. Sorry. Go ahead, Grant. Yeah, sorry.
You're fine. I come loaded with bad jokes, so you're fine. But I think there's certain people, like, I think Skylar and I kind of almost thrive off of it, and we're that type of people, but not everyone thrives off of that. Yeah. I know that for a fact. And you kind of build up, first of all, I think one of the best things you can do, and politely retort or be upfront, like call it as it is back at them. At a certain point, if someone says, picks up the call, unhappy that you called, you can email me, you can link to me. Like you chances are you already did. So call it as it is. Say, I already did and you didn't respond. That's how I ended up here. And doing that politely in a way that's respectful is a great way to balance that rejection, because you do have to stand up for yourself at a certain point, as long as you can manage it respectfully and you're not just like actually throwing it back at them, So I don't know how some people accept and balance that rejection, but Skylar would probably have a better answer here.
Yeah, so I'm going to look at this in a different way. Rejection is one step closer to a yes. And my manager always said that too. It's like, if you get a no, then you're that much closer to a yes, and it's a no. And whether that rejection is like, no, we don't need this right now, which that's probably your best answer, or no, I really don't want to talk to you right now. It's like, okay, I have this guy's number. Maybe I can call him back next week and he wants to talk to me. Or like just kind of flipping the script on like, rather than it being a no, like having the mindset that it's going to be your one step.
Yeah. I mean, no is an answer, right? And I think that's probably the other piece of it versus like the unknown of not hearing anything.
Mm-hmm. And I could kind of like we were talking about earlier, like the metaphor with baseball, and like in baseball, you're failing more times than you're succeeding, and that is mentally so taxing. And so it's the same thing with sales. Like I call 100 people we'll just, again, arbitrary numbers. I call 100 people per day. 10 people pick up. One person wants to book a meeting. Like that's a lot of different people to touch in order to gain success. But holding on to those nuggets of success is what makes it so worth it. Because like once that happens, you're like, oh my God, this is awesome. And it's so worth calling 100 different people every time and having more of like, and we talked about this actually last week, like in our newsletter, we talked about like the abundance mindset versus the scarcity mindset. Abundance meaning like this is working for me versus scarcity being this is working against me. And so I think it's really important from like our perspective to always think in the positive half glass full mentality, because if you're not, then it's actually like probably not going to work out for you.
No, I love that.
That is the most like, if take that as like the number one perspective rule for being an SDR. If you look with the glass empty, you will not be successful. And if you look with the glass half full, you will be exceptionally. And as part of that, it's looking for an opportunity, because there's always something you can take and learn. And, I think about like, no matter what it is, no matter what the call is, whether it's a good and bad fit, et cetera, there's always something you could have done better. And if you look at it like that, the glass is half full, there's something I could have done to improve myself, that will put you farther ahead in saying, I had a perfect call and he sucked on the other line.
Yep. Perfect. Well, so what I wanted to do was save some time for you. So I've spent 45 minutes now, like peppering you guys with questions. I'm going to put myself in the hot seat and help answer questions for you guys, right? And anything like you're dying to know about RevOps, and also for the audience, like feel free to drop questions into the chat as well if there's anything you want to know. So I will call it like I see it and answer you guys' questions.
Skylar's on base first.
Okay. I guess like from a RevOps perspective, like what do you think? I think there's like a fine line between quality versus quantity. I'm assuming that quality is probably what you guys are placing the most value on because those are the people that
that's the output, right?
Yeah, but also like how much do you weigh quality against quantity and how much should we weigh against it in order to like best allocate like who we're reaching out to versus who we're not? Does that kind of make sense?
It does make sense, right? Like, and at the end of the day, what we're doing is like math and science, right? That's, there's an art form to this, and there's rough math behind things. Just to your point, like, right, Skylar, is like you need to reach out to 100 people to maybe get one demo booked, and there are different levels of like the quality that goes into there, but we also know that there has to be a quantity factor to get that output. And so, when I think about like how RevOps can really support SDR behavior, I think a lot of my time is spent on operational efficiencies as it relates to administration, right? So there's a lot of administrative tasks that you guys do while you're prospecting to hit those pieces. So things that I can look at and things that I can improve to help augment how long it takes to do those like 100 calls, right? Do you have a power dialer? Do you have the right like process and pace? Do we have a way to not one by one source phone numbers? Where can we help get that from a delivery standpoint, while also helping to support from a scoring and a grading standpoint to support, what we can do best in class for the quality piece, right? At the end of the day, there's things that we're not going to know from a quality perspective. And, if any SDRs are in here and they're only getting super hot, super qualified leads, like ride out that storm, because like you're sitting in a good place. But sometimes you've got to kiss a couple of toads, right, before you find your prince. And like that's how we learn too. And that's why I think, this relationship is so important from a feedback perspective as well. So I look at SDRs, you guys are, you're the face of the company. Realistically, for anything that's not coming inbound and self-finding us, your SDRs are the face and are your brand. So what can I do to best represent the brand and best support the brand is kind of how I think through like supporting the team.
Great, go for it.
And this is going to be a little bit too generalized, but from your point of view in RevOps, what would be the perfect SDR workflow? Because I mean, and I'm not talking about specific tech stack, but like if you had an SDR that was producing perfect results, because your goal is to kind of empower us, what is the most reward out of empowerment you want to see? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, ultimately, like I want SDRs who are I want the same thing that the SDRs want, right? I want people who are successful. But what I look for here is back to consistency, right? So when I think about what is the perfect SDR, like there's a consistent process we can scale against. And that's what I think sets organizations up like from success and failure with SDRs is like when you don't have that consistent process, right? People, process, data, technology. I can build the best technology in the world, but if we don't have a process that supports it, that's adhered to, that we can measure against, I can't improve anything, right? You can't improve what you don't track. And so I think it's really important that we have, a consistent process adherence that we can scale against, right? If everyone's, go ahead.
All right. No, so maybe not, you're not necessarily looking for the perfect SDR. You're looking for the most data and not consistent again, so you can see where do we need to improve, where do we need to not improve.
I mean, I want the perfect SDR in my mind, right? If I'm looking at a person and like what keeps you on or off my shit list, like let's go with that, is the one who's like following process, right? And like I can actually like measure against, because if I can't improve it, right? So if Skylar comes to me and she's like, man, like my conversion rates to booking demos is like horrible right now, like what's happening, right? Like how can I best help Skylar? Right? Like I can look at like what's the process that she's following and where are breakpoints in that process, right? If we're seeing fall off between, you know, for step 1 and step 2 in the sequence, and that's where the friction point is, because she has a consistent process we can measure against, we can work on areas of optimization. But if Skylar's going rogue and like doing random things, you know, random acts of sales, fly by the seat of your pants prospecting, like it's really hard to make it better because I don't know what's actually wrong.
Okay.
So my perfect SDR is the one who at least follows a process that we can then iterate on.
Okay. So I love that. I think then to piggyback on that answer, how can SDRs then, like, what would you suggest that SDRs do in order to, I guess, foster a relationship and use RevOps to our best advantage in order to ensure that our processes are then being perfected?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where, you know, Grant made this point at the beginning, like forming that relationship. You know, so often when we think about RevOps is like there's, you know, sales ops under that, right? Like, and no offense to SDRs, I don't think they always get the same amount of love as like an AE, right? Or an AM or a CSM, right? So like part of this is being like really mindful of like where SDR and SDR operations and BDR operations like fit in your business strategy and your business priority. Because I know realistically from a pipeline perspective, if I can improve, you know, productivity of an SDR. So Grant and Skylar, like if I could save you 20% of your day on like a tedious task, what's the output that creates? And then what's the downstream, you know, pipeline and revenue that generates? Like those are huge dials to turn that I think a lot of companies overlook. And I've been guilty of it too. You know, we generally are like, we've thrown this body, they're going to go do prospecting, and we really don't have a good prospecting strategy. We haven't equipped them with process. We don't have, you know, we're praying, spray and pray. And like, again, the things I think about, we're not thinking about our brand when we do this. We're not thinking about the customer experience. We're not setting this team up for success. And like, they're all very much red flags that I think a lot of companies overlook. So building those relationships, understanding the pain points, building the right model, right? Again, back to the productivity piece. Like if I can make Skylar 10% more productive in her prospecting and more accurate and more efficient, what's the return on that?
Yeah. And I think having those supplements would then allow for us, going back to the idea of creativity, to be more creative. And like to kind of like tie this all in a bow, we onboard, we create these processes that you guys give us, and they're through our tech stack, having those things. That's where we go into the quantity piece. And then as we keep moving forward, we understand how to prospect. We understand maybe like what works for us, what doesn't. We start to build our personal brand. We keep moving forward. And as we move forward, then we start to get like that prospecting side a little bit supplemented. And then we use that time to then be creative in a way that starts to work for us, that we're seeing our performance like the most effective. And it's different for everyone. And like, that's probably why it's so difficult to measure in a sense, because I am good at calling, but then the next person's really good at sending LinkedIn messages. And for some reason that just works differently for one person versus another, but we're still giving the same results. So having those supplementations and having that like effective, I don't know if it's a list or like a whatever, like some sort of prospecting list or like even any sort of data, whatever that is, then can allow for us to try, fail, succeed in like sort of a creative way. And I think that's like where we can then make that, I called it 30% earlier, but that's again an arbitrary number, that 30% of creativity go to 50%. so on and so forth.
And then how do we learn from that creativity and then scale it, right? And when we think about the process and what's working, and at the end of the day, like my role in RevOps, I don't look at this as like, the process dictator and like, Grant, Skylar, don't stray from course, right? My role is to try to help give a good, standard operating procedure that can empower the creativity that we can learn from and scale, but like still have the consistency that we need to be able to measure and track performance.
I have a question actually for you on that. If we kind of go back to the onboarding conversation and say RevOps had set up the perfect onboarding step by step, you do this, these are your results. It works, 80, 90% of the time. And obviously, as a company grows larger and larger, that's going to get more refined and more repetitive and more just do this systematically.
Yep.
How would you ensure or spark creativity in SDRs through that onboarding process to ensure that maybe they'll come up with a new process, or maybe they'll find a new opportunity, or find something that allows that creativity? How do you spark that and create that while managing to have a very systematic setup that works from a RevOps point of view?
Yeah. So I think, there's components that like, process, there has to be some guardrail in process, right? Like you can't, again, go to like have everybody be like, oh yeah, go pick your own tool and do these own things. But like, I don't think it's my role in RevOps to be like, here's your script, right? Here's, first thing is a call, 5 days later is an email. Like, I don't see that as my role in RevOps. My role in RevOps is to say like, hey, when we run data and like run analysis on like our sequences, these are our top performing ones, right? Like, and help to give that framework. But that's, to me, is like, that's what we're seeing, and we should test against that and always be like iterating. But my role is like, this is the process that we should follow in terms of if somebody says, do not call me, here's how that should cascade through and how we should track. It's not here's, I'm going to say the playbook to do your job and like check each box over and over again. I think you need that when you're first onboarding, right? Like, so somebody who's coming in and is net new as an SDR, if I said like, here's, this, go figure it out, they're not going to get there always as easier as somebody like who you give the very specifics to. But it's identifying like where you have more of that autonomy versus like where you still need to make sure like you're managing the process the right way from a reporting standpoint.
Awesome.
I agree. I think when you first start out, and I mean, I'm just saying this because when I came into this role, I came from a completely different industry. So I'm like, when you first start out, you need those processes and you need to have like this is what I do. This is how I'm going to structure my day. So I do it exactly the way. And like, that's why you have that time to ramp to see what's working for you and like get as many like trials in, like kind of like refine your like different talk track or like different like way to structure your day, whatever that is. Like that's why that ramping period is there. But I do think that like onboarding and having those processes in place in the first place are so important to have like your fundamentals in place.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys. I know we're at time. Any final thoughts before we sign off for the day? Follow the Quota Killers on LinkedIn. You'll get your dose of good tips and tricks. Any thoughts, guys?
Thank you for joining us on this and inviting us and taking a few minutes to talk with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was super fun. I feel like I still learned a bunch, right? And just this conversation, even though I spend a bunch of time with you guys on the daily, but I think, it's really good perspective as we think about, revenue operations being more than just sales or marketing or CS operations. Like there's a big piece of the funnel that can have tremendous impact, and, going to that front line of prospecting and really figuring out how you turn those dials. So thank you guys so much, and we'll catch everyone next week. Take care. Bye.